From Vassar College, this is Conversations at the Salt Line. On this episode, a conversation with Laura Trevelyan.
Hello everyone, it's me, Wes, again, and welcome to another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. Today, I'm here with veteran journalist, advocate for reparations in the Caribbean and across the world, Laura Trevelyan. Thank you for being here.
Wes, it's great to be with you on this very snowy day on campus. I know we can't see it in the studio, but it's a winter wonderland.
They can tell
there
from our outfits that it's kind of cold outside.
Yeah, I mean, you look more chic than me.
No. You look pretty chic. You have some bright, warm colors on in this very cold winter.
I'm admiring this. What would you describe it as?
I don't know, a shawl, a blanket, a
Yeah.
caftan.
You're looking good.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Welcome to campus.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. I've heard this is not your first time on campus. You were here for some other reason. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so my middle son played college squash. And so I had the great privilege as a squash parent of coming to watch the Wesleyan Vassar matches because my son played at Wesleyan.
And who won more often than not?
Well, let's just draw a veil over that.
Okay, we'll leave it alone.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I saw just as of a day ago is that you have a new honor and probably a new responsibility as a chancellor of a university in the UK. Tell me about it.
Well, yeah, I'm honoured. So I went to Cardiff University to do a postgraduate diploma in newspaper journalism after my undergrad at Bristol University many, many years ago.
Yeah.
And I've kept up a relationship with the university, and they, out of the blue, at the end of last year, invited me to be their next chancellor, which is, by the way, it's not like the vice-chancellor runs the university. Like, Betsy is the president of Vassar.
Yes.
The chancellor, it's a ceremonial role where you
Understood.
wear a gown at graduation, but also you're an ambassador for the university beyond its walls. It's a medieval concept, the idea of the walls of the university. So I couldn't be more proud to be an ambassador for Cardiff University in Wales. I mean, British universities are going through a bit of a rough time at the moment.
Yeah.
At Cardiff, with falling numbers of international students and a little bit of a cash crisis. But I'm absolutely thrilled because Cardiff gave me so much, a career and a husband. I met my husband there too.
Incredible.
I'm over the moon.
Well, and of course it's exciting and it's an honor, but it's not a mistake. And I'm sure the university, with intention, knew the work you have been doing, knew the work you're continuing to do, and thought that work is an important thing to amplify and to highlight as a value of themselves as they go into the next chapter. And so I think, again, you are not a mistake in that role. It's a really exciting testament to what you have done and what they want to support you to continue to do.
Well,
so
it's nice of you to say, Wes, and I'm thrilled. I'm now practicing my Welsh, which is virtually non-existent. But I learned to say on social media yesterday, diolch, which is thank you in Welsh.
Well, you're much better than me. So and you're a lifelong learner, clearly, which we appreciate here at Vassar. So you've had an incredible life, from what I can tell, and we're going to talk more about it, of course, in our conversation. And sort of, I think the first part of your life, I should say, if you will, is as this veteran journalist at the BBC, which you did. You spent time, of course, in the UK, but also here in the States. And so we won't spend most of our time talking about this, but I'm curious just what your key reflection, you've retired, I understand, from that work at the BBC.
I've left the BBC, but I haven't retired as a journalist.
You're always a journalist. You're always learning and reading and storytelling.
Exactly.
But what have been some of your key sort of takeaways, insights, sort of reflections about your career in journalism heretofore?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I just had an amazing time at the BBC. I absolutely loved it. It was a privilege. It was a joy. I had fantastic colleagues. I went all over the world. The BBC's in a unique position in that it's funded by British taxpayers through something called the licence fee. Everyone who has a television or a radio set is required to buy this licence fee. And that's how the BBC is funded. So it's funded publicly, but it's not state broadcasting.
Understood.
It's journalistically independent, which I know, I remember when I was the BBC's UN correspondent, the Chinese ambassador to the UN would always say to Britain's ambassador, why can't you control what she's asking? You know, it's state broadcasting. And the British ambassador would chuckle and say, well, first of all, if only I could control what she's asking. And secondly, I think you misunderstand the unique nature of the BBC, which, yes, it's publicly funded, but no, it's not state broadcasting. So that privilege to be able to go all over the world, ask questions on behalf of the British audience and the global audience too was amazing, really. And I had many career highlights, but I guess the moment that I really appreciated the position first was in the late 1990s in Belfast in Northern Ireland, when something called the Good Friday Agreement was being negotiated, which brought an end to the troubles in Northern Ireland, which had seen the Irish Republican Army at war with the British state. And it was a complicated and bloody conflict, and I got to be there reporting on the diplomatic efforts to bring it to an end. And I was literally there at 3 a.m. in Belfast when news of an agreement began to spread through the corridors. And that was just an extraordinary moment to be witness to history in that way. And it was actually a member of the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland. Very significant and important part of the negotiations in very kind of male-dominated Northern Ireland back then. And by the way, that's changed too. But it was the fact that it was a member of the Women's Coalition that broke the news was also very exciting because it pointed to a changing Northern Ireland. So, yeah, it was, I had an incredible time. I got to go to all kinds of places, to Sri Lanka at the end of the Civil War, to Darfur, to Mexico for the elections, to Brazil, to Haiti. I got to go everywhere and to be paid essentially to ask questions. And so it was phenomenal. And the last 12 years I was an anchor for the BBC's World News America broadcast on PBS. But I always took care to anchor on location whenever I could, whenever there was breaking news. And actually I was on the steps of the US Capitol on January the 6th, 2021. Another unforgettable day and another moment of being witness to history. And I heard the chant of "Stop the Steal" long before I saw the crowd that would eventually ransack the Capitol. And that was also another moment where you knew that something was about to unfold, just because, sound travels more quickly. And so the sound of the crowd arrived first.
You've been, needless to say, in the middle of, and you're obviously comfortable with, complicated moments and
I like complexity.
Complicated parts of history and of life, which clearly has defined your time at the BBC, but obviously, as we'll talk about in a moment, has defined a new part of your life, which I think many people have gotten to know you from in the last few years. I know the story. Our listeners may not know the story, but you have discovered through family members, other people, a very complex relationship to slavery in the West Indies. And so just because it'll form a lot of our conversation, if you can just give us and the listener sort of a quick primer. I know it's complicated, so we're not necessarily quick, but let's give us some foundational stories that we can build from our conversation.
Well, slavery in the United States was, of course, originally British slavery.
Of course.
Because
we were colonies.
We were right. This was British North America when slavery was introduced here, but it was an extension of something Britain was already doing in the West Indies. So, but of course, fast forward all these years, and the way that slavery was taught when I was growing up and when I was at school was we British abolished slavery in 1834, and those terrible Americans, they didn't abolish it till much later after their Civil War. And that was literally all I learned. Not that actually it's all the same thing.
Right.
So that was my rather tenuous understanding, is that there was a gentleman in 19th century Britain called William Wilberforce who was a hero because he somehow single-handedly abolished slavery or persuaded Parliament.
He was sort of our Abe Lincoln, or your Abe Lincoln.
Right. Not that he was inspired by the enslaved in the West Indies who rose up against the terrible treatment. But anyway, so that was my sort of basic understanding, which was pretty basic. And of course, as one gets older, one reads more and the rest of it. But this is really a tribute to the role of academia in public life. The way that I found out about my ancestors' relationship to enslavement is that University College London in 15-ish, they put online a database of all of the compensation that was paid to Britain's slave owners when slavery was abolished.
Right.
Not compensation to the formerly enslaved.
Right.
Compensation to the slave owners so that they would,
of course,
what was called the West India interest, would vote for abolition in Parliament without
Right.
this massive amount of compensation for the loss of what was termed their property, which is how the enslaved were referred to. Abolition would never have happened in Britain. You know, a big interest had to be paid off. So these compensation records, when they go online, you know, there are more than 30,000 claims that are made by different slave owners in Britain at the time, including various members of the Trevelyan family who are all making claims for different plantations in Grenada, which is a small island in the Eastern Caribbean, as you'll know. And I was living in the States at the time. I didn't follow the publication of the database, but then various family members who must have suspected or wondered or were curious, you know, typed the name Trevelyan into the database, and it comes up with all these compensation claims and Grenada. So people then wrote to me because, Laura, you're a journalist, you've written
you're on TV,
books.
you have a platform.
Yeah,
all these
well,
things.
what are you going to do about this? Did you know about this? This is terrible. What does this mean? And I was like, well, I don't know what this means. This is really overwhelming information. I need to think about it. I need to research it. And I want to interject there just for a moment, because I've heard you talk about this story before, and something that stuck out to me in previous iterations of the story was that you very honestly said that your initial reaction was sort of one of journalistic intrigue. Absolutely.
Not what other folks might assume it might be, which is, I don't know.
No, not moral
guilt or
not
some
moral outrage.
Sort of,
no.
Calculus. That wasn't what it was,
No.
right? And I'm just curious on this point, because these sort of emotional questions, I think, hinge on the broader conversation of reparations around the world. What do you make of your reaction being one of sort of a distance, if you will? There was sort of a clinical response to it as opposed to sort of an emotional one. How do you reflect on that?
I mean, you know, I'm a journalist. So to me, this was a story. And it was a way into a story, but it was also, to me, a microcosm of Britain's amnesia about its role in the transatlantic slave trade. And in the case of our family particularly, the reason that so many people, family members, wrote and were outraged is that our family in the 19th century were historians and officials in government, officials of empire in India and in Ireland. And so all of us knew about this. And one of our relatives, my great-grandfather, George Macaulay Trevelyan, was the best-selling historian of Britain in the first half of the 20th century. And his history of England also celebrates abolition. And yet he must have known that he was descended from enslavers, because he was that much closer to it. And yet nobody alive today, my father and his generation, they didn't know about this link to slavery. Sure. So it's all been suppressed, because as soon as abolition happened, the national narrative was, well, how terrible. And look at those Americans, they've still got slavery.
Right.
And to me, that was the story, that we were a microcosm of a broader suppression of an ugly period.
Absolutely. And just because you would have proximity to these people, I want to ask, sort of, when your father and other sort of older relatives, who I imagine had lots of pride in the parts of family history they did know,
yes,
right, when they sort of had this additional layer added to it, what were their reactions? How did they sort of absorb or integrate this new data into their already crafted narrative of their family? It's
a very interesting question, and it shows you how age affects how you view things. Mm-hmm. So my father's in his 80s, and I guess then they were in their 70s, but my father was a distinguished public servant. His older brother, a doctor, a general practitioner, someone who devoted his life to healing. And I think they were both profoundly shocked and also really surprised, because they remembered my great-grandfather, who I never met. So these distinguished Trevelyans who'd had a role in crafting the national narrative, it was all at odds with their vision of the family as liberal reformers and people who did good. But for me, you see, I'd worked in Northern Ireland, as I was saying, and in Northern Ireland, just across the border, is the Irish Republic. And the Irish famine in the 19th century was a traumatic event, the potato famine in Ireland. And one of these Trevelyans, who in Britain has a reputation for being a distinguished reformer of the civil service, he was also the official in charge of famine relief during the Irish famine. So he's notorious in Ireland. And I'd come across him.
In a negative way.
No kidding. Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams, who were the leaders of Sinn Féin, which was then regarded as the political wing of the Irish Republican Army, they used to tease me about the fact that I was related to Sir Charles Trevelyan in a way that wasn't that funny.
Of course.
So I knew about that side of it too. And so then when the slavery came up, it wasn't so surprising to me because, legacies of empire are complicated.
Of course. Absolutely.
And there's a lot going on. So I guess I wanted to dig into it.
Absolutely. So, and I cut you off in sort of the primer of the story. So you, of course, found these records with the help of your other family members. You sat with it for some time, thought about how you would live with it, address it, all those kinds of things. And then what happened? Yeah,
so I thought about it. I began to read more widely about the history of slavery in the West Indies, about abolition, just to learn more. And this scholarship that was published by UCL prompted a lot of reckoning because the families who get compensation are still what you might describe as leading families in Britain today. So there's a link between the wealth that came from slavery and social position hundreds of years later. I mean, in the case of our family, it's not wealth, but definitely social standing, which is at least partially linked to slavery. So I thought about it, and, then 4 years later, an opportunity came in the form of Black Lives Matter and the debate here in the United States following the death of George Floyd. So anchoring every night for the BBC, we're doing interviews about this, thinking about how if a legacy of slavery in the United States is police brutality towards black men, so what's happening in the Caribbean? How is this moment of reckoning affecting the debate there? And funnily enough, Grenada became the last island in the Caribbean after Black Lives Matter to set up a national reparations committee to try and define what reparations for slavery from the former colonial powers would look like. So that gave me an opportunity to say to the BBC, there's a debate in Grenada now about reparations for slavery, and could I use this family history as a way in to that broader debate?
And on this, before this sort of cultural and historical moment sort of served as a catalyst for this entry point, where were you? Where was your mind? What were you thinking you might do? How are you thinking about it?
I mean, nowhere really. I was just reading and trying to find out more and trying to think. I mean, what I wanted to do was a story about it because that's always, I guess that's why I am. I'm a journalist, and that's how you can get a story to a wider audience. It's how you can affect change. It's how you can shine a light. So I was just looking for a way to do that, really. And then
there was
a way. And then you see Grenada reacting to these images of George Floyd, and
then you went.
It ripples across the Caribbean.
Of course. And then you went to Grenada, of course.
Yes.
On sort of a I guess you wouldn't call it a homecoming at all, but on a trip, just sort of, I would understand it as being more proximate to sort of the history that you had just recently learned, or sort of see it in a way that's not sort of on paper, but rather in real life. How was that trip for you?
Well, yes. So the BBC let me go to make a documentary called Grenada, Confronting the Past, about this history. And my boss in London, Hugh Levinson, said, well, Laura, you can't go unless you ask everybody in Grenada that you meet, should I apologise for the actions of my ancestors, and should I personally pay reparations? He said, you just can't go unless you ask everybody that question. So, and the producer, Coralie Barreau, was absolutely on board for that too. And so we had these instructions from on high. This is not going to be a jolly in the Caribbean at the British taxpayers' expense. You got to ask the tough questions of yourself. Otherwise, what you're doing won't have any credibility. And so in advance of the trip, I wrote to this Grenadian historian, Nicole Philip Dow, who I could see was the vice chair of Grenada's reparations committee. So I wrote to her saying, I'm descended from enslavers in Grenada, and I'm a journalist, and I want to come and make a documentary. Could we chat? And then she replied literally within minutes saying, oh, Laura from the BBC, I have a big smile on my face. Let's talk. And I was so relieved because you don't know how that sort of an
course.
email will necessarily be received. But actually, the fact is, Grenada's an incredibly warm, welcoming, confident place where people were like, well, where have you been all these years? You
We've been looking for you.
We've been waiting. We've been waiting to have this chat.
Yeah.
And this isn't something you did.
Right.
And just as it's not something that
we experienced.
we weren't trafficked from Africa, but we lived with the consequences. And so it's great that you're here and let's talk.
Yeah.
So that, and I think that's probably a very different experience maybe to here in the United States.
Well, yes, we'll certainly get into that in a moment. But it's an incredible.
Because, Grenada's a black-run society. It's confident. It's tiny. It's 110,000 people.
Yeah.
But it's making its way in the world.
Yeah. One of the main differences, as I'm sure you know, and I think this is interesting on this podcast with these sort of salt lines, right, is that there's an interesting way in which sort of, your family, as you've said, were absentee slave owners. They weren't living in Grenada at the time. It was an investment, if you will.
Yeah.
And
revolting as that is.
Exactly. And Great Britain was also sort of absentee in some ways from its colonies, right? Sort of the British people were not living in the way that the Americans are, if you will, with those who were enslaving them.
No, there was no proximity. The Atlantic Ocean was in between.
Exactly.
Apart from these overseers.
Sure.
Who often played this brutal role, who were terrified often of their enslaved populations.
Yeah.
And the things that happened were out of sight.
Yeah. What makes your story interesting to me is the moment in which you and I are talking. Because, as I'm sure you know, the conversation about reparations, or reparatory justice, I should say, or both of those things, has been going on for a while. But I think
acres and a mule.
Absolutely. At least in this country, that's sort of the thing that we use to talk about it with in part. But it's happening now still. It's not a dead conversation, right? Just this week, the African Union had their conference that was themed on reparatory justice for Africans and those of African descent, right? And so it's interesting that there seems to be a galvanizing of the Caribbean nations and of the African nations around this concept of reparatory justice. At the same time, at least in this country, there is sort of a stark move away from conversations that even sort of lend themselves towards being clear and honest about the harms that were committed, and then as such what should be done because of that. So it's a very funny sort of movement and polarization in the world relative to this concept. You had incredible experience with this and grappling with the complexities of it, obviously. And so I'm just curious sort of how your experience as a family, as an individual, helps or complicates your understanding of this moment in this country and in the world.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, you see, to me, the Caribbean's case for reparations from the former colonial powers is very clear-cut.
In what way?
Because these islands are there in the Caribbean, thousands of miles from Africa, thousands of miles from Britain. People were, as is the case here in the United States, but these tiny societies, and this is the difference with the US, tiny societies in the Caribbean were created artificially by theft and trafficking and robbing people of their future. And now these islands become independent from Britain over a period of, Grenada's been independent now for 50 years, Jamaica for 60. And through that independence, an intellectual movement that began before, but Eric Williams, classic Capitalism and Slavery was written, I think, in 1944. But the Caribbean's case for reparations from Britain, because of the economic extraction, the brutality, the way that these islands at abolition were left with literally nothing.
Right.
People were illiterate. The economic structure of slavery was in place. The planters might have left. The enslaved were no longer enslaved, but they were essentially paid a pittance by descendants of the same people who had enslaved them. And so, if you go to somewhere like Grenada, which is now, has always been in the hurricane belt, but now the increasingly intense storms, the storm that hit Grenada's sister islands of Carriacou and Petit Martinique in July, Hurricane Beryl, intensified from a tropical storm to a Cat nearly 5 in less than 48 hours.
Right.
People didn't even know it was coming. They had no way to get out.
Right.
I mean, it was just an awful situation. So the legacies which are so direct and which you can't expect a nation of 110,000 people to be able to solidify itself against, to become resilient against the changing climate. So the argument that Britain owes a debt to its, and France as well, and the Dutch, that they owe a debt to their former Caribbean colonies because they extracted all of the wealth and left them with nothing. Yeah. And now the very least they can do is invest in climate resiliency funding and education. To me, that's it's clear cut.
And I want to tarry on that point for one moment, because I think implicit in what you said is a much broader understanding of reparatory justice than people might assume initially. Because I would assume, and I think it is an off base to say, people think of reparations as only in strictly sort of cash payouts, right? Which is a space for, and we'll talk about that in a moment, because you have experience with that too. But I think what you just mentioned is sort of reparatory justice framework that includes different kinds of non-cap but meaningful investments in things that do help societies and countries and nation states or whatever. And I think it's funny because the language of reparations, I think, is always very interesting. Because it sort of politicizes or sort of opens up or closes down conversations quickly or intensely, depending on where you are and who you're talking to.
Right. Well, and so the Caribbean since 2013 has had a 10-point plan for reparations from the former colonial powers. And point number 1 is an apology, a full and formal apology for what happened. And then it moves on to investment in health and education and debt forgiveness. But again, the difference to here in the States, and this is because these societies are almost entirely comprised of people who are descended from enslaved Africans. But the demand is not for an individual cash payment. It's for, as you say, investment in these societies, which are almost entirely comprised of people who are descendants, which is why the demand isn't for an individual cash payment, because any investment would benefit everybody. So our family, after in the wake of the documentary that I made, in which everybody I met said, as I'd been told to ask this question, but literally everybody from school child to Grenadian
elder,
exactly. Everyone said the same thing. Yeah, of course you can apologize on behalf of what your ancestors did, and it would be meaningful to us. It's not just a performative gesture. And secondly, yes, you should pay reparations, because look at the difference in power, privilege, and wealth all these years after the abolition of slavery.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it would be a drop in the ocean, but that would also be important, and it would set an example.
Yeah. The amount of money that I understand that you set up initially in the reparations fund was $100,000 or pounds.
Pounds, yes.
And
a little bit more in dollars.
A little bit more in dollars, which, of course, as you've heard from many people more than I have, could be received as sort of like, oh, how dare she only give $100,000, right, or pounds rather, when her family at that time got what would be 3 million pounds in today's money, if you will.
Well,
right?
That was just to abolition, and that doesn't include all of the
all
money,
the other
merchant
funds,
sugarcane in the meantime. Yeah.
And so, let's talk about that, because obviously part of the complication, right, that there is an argument to be made that people are against the idea of reparations because, there's not a clear sense, amount, length of time, or whatever at which you're done, right? Mm-hmm. And in your case, the money certainly is not enough to make up for sort of all the different disparities that exist in Grenada in particular, right? And so how have you come to sit with the amount of money? How have you felt the amount of money has made you feel like satisfactorily involved in the preparatory effort? Like, just talk to me about that part of the equation.
Well, I mean, it's ongoing. So yes, in August of 2023, yes, I gave £100,000 towards, education funds in Grenada, and it was for Grenada's reparations committee and Grenada's government to decide how that money would be spent. And we've also then subsequently set up a family charity in Britain called the Trevelyan Grenada Reparation Fund. And we're fundraising from family, and we have two different causes that we're supporting. One is bursaries for students at the University of the West Indies open campus, global campus, which is a remote campus. The University of Grenada is too small to support an actual physical university. So these are students who are working, have families, and are pursuing undergraduate degrees a little bit later in life. And then the second thing that we're supporting is a charity that's existed in Grenada for 26 years called Grenada, which is in Grenville, which is a rural area of Grenada. And essentially that supports scholarships for those children to help their parents with the costs of school. Because when you live in rural Grenada, well, anywhere in the Caribbean, everything is imported. Backpacks, school uniforms, diesel for school buses is important. So all these costs really add up, like getting the bus to school even is expensive. So that's what we're doing, and we raised £20,000 in our first year. And I was just in Grenada just over a week ago, actually, and that £100,000 that I'd given the University of the West Indies used some of that to create bursaries for 24 students. So I got to meet the students, and I got to hear about, and they're all from parishes in Grenada, or most of them are, where the Trevelyans own plantations. That's how the University of the West Indies chose these students. They're outstanding students, they are in financial need, and they're from areas where the Trevelyans own plantations. But to me, it's about looking forward as well as looking back, and it was a joy to meet these students and hear about their plans to be economists, psychologists, to have important managerial positions in the growing tourism industry in Grenada. And it was exciting. And Nicole Phillip, this historian I was talking about, Grenadian historian who's an administrator at the University of the West Indies, she said, well, Laura, this is reparations in action. I mean, nothing is simple. No money can ever be enough. But it's a start, and we'll see how it develops.
That's a beautiful story. And as you were talking, I was curious about the emotional relationship between you and, in this example, the students you're talking about, right? Because there's a way in which, of course, we give scholarships and funds here at Vassar too, right? And there's a way in which I'm curious and maybe concerned that even that interaction with you meeting the students could be perceived as sort of paternalistic in some way, right? In a way that maybe does not actually disrupt sort of the effort of reparations, right? Like it might maintain this relationship where
you could also say it's like classic white saviorism.
Sure.
What is she doing, swanning around the Caribbean, handing out certificates? But I think in some ways that's like a fairly classic reaction from the American left, I would say. And I think the way that these things are seen in the Caribbean is different. And maybe that's because, Grenada is a black-run society. Right. The Reparations Committee has spent a long time thinking about these things. And for Nicole and her colleague Arlie Gill, we can serve as an example, hopefully, to governments.
Yes.
Like if a family can apologise and pay reparations,
then others can
then
too.
Why can't a government?
So this is actually...
So I think, people have different ways of thinking about things. And I think particularly in the sort of era of social media where it's so easy to caricature things and it's so easy to say, oh, this is just neo-colonialism. And then equally on the right, it's like, oh, this is woke nonsense. Who does she think she is? Right. She's just a naive idiot being taken for a ride by the Caribbean. You know what I mean?
No,
and obviously both things can't be true.
Right.
And to me and for the family, we've just been guided by Grenadians. And, this is about harm that our ancestors did there. It's about listening to people there. And it's also always evolving.
Absolutely.
It's not... And that's what we want, is to have relationships with people and to listen and to learn together. And, And I would say that the idea of it setting an example, which is what the Grenadians wanted, and what Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who's the chair of CARICOM's Reparations Commission and a brilliant Caribbean intellectual who wrote the seminal book Britain's Black Debt, which is very much a successor text to Eric Williams. And Hilary said he came on this Zoom with our family a few years ago, and all these sort of people in Britain who've never been to the Caribbean who are sort of concerned that these people want our money kind of thing. What is this Laura, what are you doing? Where is this going to lead?
Right.
Grenadians are going to turn up and take my pension. And Hilary said, you'll be welcome in the Caribbean because you're part of our history.
Yeah.
But our history, unlike yours, is a painful void. You know where you came from. You can trace yourselves back to the Doomsday Book. But we don't know who our ancestors were, and there's a pain in that.
Yeah.
And if you come to Grenada and publicly apologise, which was what Hilary wanted, that will be an important part of the healing.
Yeah.
And Nicole said the same thing, Nicole Phillips. So I guess, yes, it's... but I also, because I have a thick skin, because I've been asking questions for a million years of other people, I could see what they wanted and I could see what they saw in us. And so the flack is, to me, it's just noise. I know what Grenadians wanted, and it spoke to us as a family.
Yeah.
And a lot of other families have been in touch afterwards who are descended from enslavers in the British Caribbean, wanting to know what can we do?
How you navigated that.
Who do we get in touch with? So I think that Hilary and Nicole were right.
They needed an example.
They were absolutely right, and they knew as historians and as people who are in public life what it could mean.
Absolutely.
But what that leads to is another question. I mean, so fine, you have descendants of enslavers showing up and saying we would like to do something, but does it have the effect on Britain's government? I mean, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting at the end of last year, in the communique, Britain's government agreed, all the heads of government agreed to have a conversation about reparatory justice over slavery. In fact, over all of Britain's colonial past. But to me, that's significant. So a little space has opened up.
Of course, yes. You have to
to find
some leverage at some point.
Space. I mean, as you know, reparations is different to reparatory justice for the reasons we've discussed. You could argue that reparatory justice is just fuzzy and could mean whatever you want.
Want it to mean, yeah.
And that's why it's in the communique, because it's fuzzy language. But to me, it could mean some really
it opens up opportunities.
Things.
Yes, it gives some space for creative problem solving and creative collaboration.
And more of an opening to keep showing an example, keep working with the Caribbean. And through that, I've had, there are just so many ideas that one has. I mean, people in the Caribbean want historical archives in Britain, which are all the way in Britain from the period of slavery, to be digitized and available online so that they can see them. So Caribbean scholars don't have to fly all the way to London to look up a slave register from 1824.
Absolutely.
Stuff like that is not going to break any bank
in
Britain.
And
it could just be a beginning.
And absolutely. On this question, I'm actually curious, and I'm curious if others are as well. This question, because you just said it won't break the bank, right?
Of Britain,
right? And I am curious in this reparatory justice sort of conversation, what conversations have you been a part of that center around this question of finances, not just only in cash payments, but in terms of the overall cost of investment in whatever the justice agenda might be? And I guess what I'm curious about is how we are honest about the fact that most times reparatory justice efforts are done in ways that preserve the comfort of those who are giving, right? Like I shouldn't say no one, it's often probably the case that people's lifestyle does not change, right? They're giving amounts of money that still keep them comfortable, right? And ultimately, in some respect, that could be seen as sort of not a power grab, but a maintenance of power, right? We're not trying to give power away by giving so much in reparatory efforts that we are then harmed or less able to do what we want to do ourselves, right? And so I'm just curious sort of how we sit with that concept that we're giving reparations only the thing that is comfortable for us in terms of physical, monetary resources.
Well, I think colleagues in the Caribbean, and Arlie Gill, who's the chair of Grenada's Reparations Committee, always says to me, Laura, what is so much more valuable than the £100,000 that you gave and the, you know, small family charity that you're a trustee of? What's valuable is your time and how you advocate for our agenda. So, and I think that is not about money, is it? You know, in leaving the BBC and in putting my shoulder to the wheel for the Caribbean's reparatory justice agenda, that, I mean, I do have a BBC pension, which is nice. So I have that.
Yeah.
And I have a husband who, you know, who absolutely supports me financially, because I'm not earning now. I'm just living off a pension, essentially, or rather I'm living off my husband.
Yeah.
But I think the idea of time and working in concert with Grenadians to advance an agenda in the Caribbean. And I'm also I was honoured to be made a fellow of the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies. And P.J. Patterson is the longest-serving Prime Minister, who was the Prime Minister of Jamaica. And he's a very wise and brilliant man. And he said, you know, it's just important for you to advocate and be another voice in this effort to try to show how the past informs the present.
And this seems to be consistent with your comment earlier that your family, at least today, relative to several generations ago, has much more to give in sort of a social capital space than financial resources.
Well, I mean,
right?
By way of comparison, there was a member of Britain's Parliament called Sir Richard Drax, who lost his seat at the last election. But the Drax family were planters in Barbados in 1624. And the Drax family still today are significant landowners in Barbados.
Oh, wow.
And Drax Hall, which is one of these, it's a 17th century, you know, great house from the plantation. They're, you know, Barbados government, they really would like Drax Hall, and they would like the land around it as a national monument to slavery. And Richard Drax is regularly on the Sunday Times rich list in Britain as being worth hundreds of millions of pounds.
Yeah.
So, and he has so far not handed over Drax Hall or any of the land.
Yeah.
But, you know, if that was me, I would most certainly, I would think that Drax Hall and the land around it would be an incredible place to have a museum and a national monument, and that all of the people that go to Barbados for tourism would want to go there and to see and to understand what happened on that island. By the way, Barbados' government is making great strides anyway with a national museum and monument.
Of course.
Without Drax Hall. But, you know, so there are different levels of wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly.
But I guess what you're trying to get at is what my youngest son said, who was then in high school when all of this happened. He said, "Mum, this is just completely meaningless unless we give away everything that we have and we go and live as the enslaved did in Grenada." And I said, "Thank you, Ben, for that. Thank you for this, you know, but that is not what we're going to do." And he said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure. I think that would be sort of ultimately performative." But yes, to your point, though, because one is descended from enslavers in the British Caribbean who profited, does that mean that you should give away all of your worldly wealth? What do you think?
I don't know.
Well, you asked the question,
I did
Wes.
ask the question. I don't know. I know it's a question people would have. And I don't know. I think to your point, there's a way in which you would engage in a way writ large in the reparatory justice efforts that are uncomfortable, whatever that means for you, right, and your family, right, and in a way that is not easy to do, right, and you know, parting. I'm speaking for myself at this point. You know, parting from some portion of your money, my money, if I were the example, is standard and customary. You know what I mean? Like you give money to nonprofits for your taxes. You know, you do things because it's part of a system that sort of rewards you in some ways for doing that, right? There's sort of these benefits for doing that. And so you're giving away, but really you're not really giving it away because it's sort of, there's incentives for you to give it away, right? one would think, or one would question, if in these reparatory justice efforts, if the standard is to go above and beyond that, right? At the point at which giving away is no longer incentivized and beneficial for you, it actually feels uncomfortable, right? I haven't had to do that. So it's easy for me to say in concept, but it's, I think, the question that I would have for those who are engaging in this sort of work.
I think that people in Grenada would say that in the end it isn't really about money.
Right.
Because it's about, although of course it would be great if Britain's government would invest in the health and education systems of Grenada and invest in climate resiliency funding to help Grenada and other islands in the Caribbean withstand. I think that this is why the CARICOM 10-point plan begins with an apology.
Yeah.
Because that's acknowledgement of what happened. And so right now we're still in a position where Britain won't apologise because there's a fear that legally, if you apologise for something, that
you're
makes
on the hook for something.
You're on the hook, right?
And the word I think I've seen used, back to this question about language, I think is regret. Sort of there's regret for what has happened.
Regret that this happened. Slavery was abhorrent is the word, but it was legal at the time.
Yeah. A justification of sorts.
Exactly. And that's why we won't apologise, because even though it was terrible, it was legal.
It was proper at the time.
And, you know, the past is the past sort of thing.
So interesting.
And yet the Dutch government has apologised for its historic links to slavery and set up a fund to try and address legacies of slavery both in the Netherlands and in the Caribbean, although there's been a change of government, more right-wing populist government, so I don't know what's happening to that now. Yeah. But the Dutch government did apologise, and so did the Dutch king, and the sky didn't fall in.
In what happened in Aruba or in other places?
I'm
curious, like they apologized and this sort of happened.
The Dutch government, you mean?
Yeah. So then what?
Well, those islands are still Dutch.
You're right.
Not.
Yes.
Well, Aruba, I'm not sure about the status of Aruba, but so St. Martin, you know, is half Dutch.
Yes.
So, unlike in Britain, where
they're fully separate,
they're mostly independent countries. There are still some what are called British Overseas Territories, like let me think, Anguilla, because it's just so tiny so that small. It could never be, and the British Virgin Islands. Right. But mostly, the formerly British Caribbean is independent. And the French Caribbean, also part of France. So Martinique.
So very complicated,
Guadeloupe.
Right.
The legacies of colonialism live on.
They still exist.
Right. And actually, the French islands will say, oh my gosh, you know, our infrastructure is so much better than the former British islands. And this is one of the reasons why we haven't gone down the independence route, because you know, the French we're French.
Right.
So we have hospitals, roads. So it's complicated.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the counter-argument to that is that's how the French buy the acquiescence.
Yes.
And, you know, the economic structures of slavery arguably are still replicated in those places.
Of course. Let's zoom in a little bit to this country, to America, because obviously in the ways we described before, it's a little bit different today than it might be in a place like Grenada or Barbados, somewhere else, where those who are descendants of slaves in this country often live alongside descendants of enslavers.
This proximity.
This question about proximity. And there's not the gulf of interactions that might exist between European countries and their former colonies in Africa or the Caribbean. And of course, as we said earlier, this country's in a funny spot because at this moment in time, there's sort of a way in which, at least on the national political stage, there's less tolerance for communicating about things in ways that acknowledge the effect of race or past trauma on the current moment. That said, I want to be fair and clear that there are reparatory justice efforts and actions that are and have taken place in this country. So it's not a
Evanston, Illinois.
100%. For those who don't know, maybe give them a primer on that.
Well, I think it's very interesting. I mean, it's arguably the most targeted reparations idea that has been enacted. So in Evanston, Illinois, and this, by the way, is subject to a legal challenge currently, but they managed in Evanston, Illinois to vote for and set up reparations for people who either were discriminated against and redlined in housing, or could show that their immediate ancestors suffered from housing discrimination. Right. And so small amounts of money have been paid to help people get on the housing ladder. And to me, that's really extraordinary and important, because it's so targeted that you can't disagree with it. Well, it's very, very difficult to disagree with it unless philosophically you're opposed to the whole thing conceptually. And it's practical. It's helping people, a very small amount of people, by the way, but get onto the housing ladder, people who are discriminated against historically. But there is a legal challenge. So we'll see where that goes.
In this country, one of the stories that resonates the most with me about reparations, although they don't use that word, but that's what it is in Rosewood in Florida. And I'm from Florida, not Rosewood, but from the state of Florida. And I don't know, have you heard of this? Have you heard of this case before?
No.
I think you'll find it very interesting. So in 1923, there was a massacre in this small town in Florida called Rosewood. And it was a black town, so to speak. There were maybe about 24.
Like what happened in Tulsa.
Yes, exactly. The same sort of thing, right? Same sort of thing. And so just 2 years ago in 2023 was the 100-year anniversary of sort of the Rosewood massacre. But actually in 1994, the Florida State Legislature, Jeb Bush at the time, actually, agreed to pay the survivors, because there were still some of them who were alive, or their descendants of the Rosewood Massacre. Of course, I'm telling the story in a rosy way. Obviously, this happened after incredible advocacy, storytelling. People had to sort of unearth this story, because of course there had been this amnesia you mentioned earlier, right? And so people had to really unearth it, right? And the legislator actually agreed to pay about $150,000, so not dissimilar from 100,000 pounds at that time, to either the individuals or their families. But it's funny, because the story of Rosewood, I think, is very instructive, because the word race was never mentioned in legislative sort of discussions. Of course, there was a strategic decision, obviously, and it was made more about property rights, concretely about the loss of property, right? The reparations were for loss of property, full stop, not because of any sort of racial sort of concept, which of course was what motivated the massacre to begin with, right? But it was able to get through this largely Republican legislator because it was just about property rights and not about race. And so it's interesting, because it's an example of sort of reparatory efforts being successful in ways that some people might feel are not dishonest, but the story is sort of strategically sort of framed, right, in a way that might feel dishonest, because it's not sort of hitting at the fundamental driver of the injustice, which is race, right? So I think there's a debate to be had about sort of the ends and means and strategy of reparatory justice efforts in this country.
Let's see what happens to the Evanston law and whether it survives the legal challenge.
Yeah. I think the other thing about Rosewood that I think you'd appreciate is that in addition to the direct payments for the property sort of seizure, there is now a scholarship for the descendants of those who were living in Rosewood, so they can have investment in education and opportunity that persists well beyond sort of the physical purchase of a home or whatever, right? And so it's an interesting model to sort of track over time and see how that survives, lasts, how it's perceived, how people who are involved engage with that fund or not.
Yeah, well, to me that is interesting, because apart from anything else, it sounds like it would survive any legal challenge because of the way that it was framed.
Right.
Which you might think was dishonest, but...
No, I don't think it's dishonest. I'm just noting that...
Maybe it was practical.
It was strategic and practical and not ideologic, but
I mean,
pragmatic.
The argument in Evanston is that it's unconstitutional to make a payment on the basis of race.
Yeah.
And to emphasize the race rather than the harm.
Yeah.
And so maybe that is the legal lesson of Rosewood.
Maybe.
I mean, it was disappointing that, as you know, there are still a couple of survivors of Tulsa who are still alive, who have tried to bring legal cases and have got nowhere.
Yeah. To your point, this to me begs the question of sort of, forgive the analogy, sort of the patchwork
It's the United States. Welcome to the U.S.
Effect of repertory efforts versus sort of a federal carte blanche, sort of broad brush effort, right? And to your point, it is very American for things to have gone the way. That said, there was things that I think could be considered to have been a federal American efforts, like LBJ's civil rights efforts in many ways, right? Could be perceived as a large portion of a repertory justice agenda that was not patchwork, right? We've lost some of those, as you know, but recently. But
well, it's very interesting. I would love to read, and maybe you can point me in the direction.
Yeah.
I would love to read an assessment of that civil rights era legislation and the impact of it.
Let's see if we can find one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to add to the pile, because it would just be interesting to see this, an unbiased assessment, if one can find such a thing.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm interested to see what the New York State Commission on Reparations will come up with.
Yeah. For those who are listening and may not know, it's interesting. New York State, I think Illinois, maybe California, are states in this country that have taken on this question of reparations through a commission of sorts. And it's interesting to sort of see these, I would describe them as progressive and innovative interventions on the canvas of a national scale that sort of doesn't allow space for that necessarily, right? And of course, the irony of things like Rosewood, right, is that it happens in a state. It happens in a state that at this moment in time has book bans and other kinds of things that, fly in the face of those kinds of efforts, right? And so it is this complicated mix of acknowledging efforts of repertory justice and progress, while also acknowledging an ecology that may not always allow that to continue. And I guess the question is, to your point, how do you work in ways that are sort of ambidextrous? You're sort of working for these patchwork, sort of spot-specific kinds of justice, and at the same time trying to make systematic and ecologic changes that allow either more spot things to continue to happen or promote sort of larger, broader, federal, governmental, nation-state conversations. Yeah.
I mean, the question of what is constitutional and is central to all of this, and it'll be interesting to see what the Evanston ruling is. Yeah. But even in the setting up of our small family charity in Britain there's something called the Equalities Law, and the Charities Commissioner in Britain that regulates charities had a question about our charity, because we say in our aims that we specifically want to benefit the education of Grenadians in Grenada, not necessarily in the diaspora, but in Grenada. And so the Charities Commission had a question about whether this was actually in conflict with the Equalities Act. And we said, well, not really, because we're being so specific about what we're about.
Right.
And so they let it go because we said what we're going to do.
Right.
And it would be hard for someone to argue that we should be doing something different with our money when the charity's been set up by descendants of enslavers, absentee enslavers in Grenada with a specific aim. So I guess we were specific enough that we got over the Equalities Act. But, these are all questions that come up. Yeah. And the Chief Justice, John Roberts, is fond of saying that the answer to past discrimination is not future discrimination, which sort of tells you where the Supreme Court is on that one.
Yeah, and again, that sort of begs the question of perceptions of power, right? Because of course, discrimination hinges on power. But to your point, the quote sort of makes you realize people might perceive who has power differently at this moment in time.
President Trump has just signed an executive order talking about white South Africans who've been discriminated against.
Yes.
And welcoming them to the US. So, to your point.
Yes.
Who gets to define what discrimination is?
And it's a funny, again, a salt line of sort of experience and memory, if you will, right? Sort of where what you experience and what you remember, or what you've been told to remember, how that creates opportunity or division. access or exclusion. It's an interesting thing to consider. Before we go into our student hot seat questions, one of the things that strikes me about our whole conversation and your experience is that it's one that's rife with emotions. We've talked today in ways that are largely sort of factual, explanatory. We're telling a story, right? And of course, a story has emotions within it. But you've experienced, I'm sure, as a person and as a family, and you've witnessed as a person, an incredible range of emotions and reactions to the work that you and your family have done. And I'm just curious if we can just tease apart some of those emotions. The spirit behind my question also is because I would argue all of them are rational. Even the ones that we think might be ones we disagree with. Some of those emotions, they make sense. And I think they speak to the complicated nature of this question and this work. And maybe it's my attempt to humanize those, even who I disagree with on this topic. But I'm just curious what your experience has been grappling with and receiving the emotions of others as they hear about and engage with your work.
I think for me, it's been straightforward because I've been in public life, as it were, for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I know how things can be, that it can be turbulent out there. And, reading your notifications on social media is not generally a good idea unless you don't want to sleep at night.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, for me, as a family, we're just emblematic, as I was saying, of something bigger. So it isn't personal. And that's partly my training, And also what has been just exciting is to make so many friends in the Caribbean and to be led in a direction by intellectuals who've been thinking about this for a really long time and waiting for people to show up who never did, waiting for descendants of enslavers in the British Caribbean. So I guess, for me, it's been straightforward. But I think for other family members, that's not really the case.
Certainly.
Because they haven't been broadcast journalists for 100 million years.
Right.
And also, my husband was president of ABC News, and that was also, he also produced the January 6th hearings, congressional hearings. And, he's a public figure too. So I've had a marriage as well.
Right.
That has given me a lot of experience of flack and of...
Right.
So I guess I'm not typical really. But I know, for example, my 80-year-old uncle, who was a general practitioner, he gets very emotional when he talks about it. And he was just with me in Grenada when we were meeting students at the University of the West Indies and also school children in Grenville. And his reaction to all of it when, University College London put the compensation online, his reaction was, well, nothing to do with me. This is hundreds of years ago. Why would I mean, so what, sort of thing. Right. But then he had an epiphany. His children said to him, well, Dad, that's just racist, actually, to say that. And he's been a doctor all his life and thought in London and thought a lot about healing and what it is to heal. And he just began to think hard about it. And one of his daughters is also a psychologist. She works in Bristol in the southwest of England in an area where many people are of Caribbean descent, where there are many issues around mental health, which in her work she has come to realize is a lot to do with legacies of racism coming from right. And so my Uncle Tom really did an about face over this whole period. And listening to Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who Zoomed with our family, talking about how as a child in Barbados, he went to school with sugar in his lunchbox. And as a doctor, my Uncle Tom was just horrified about the implications of this. And, there's now an outbreak of hypertension, diabetes. These are people who had to eat sugar. And this was a legacy of slavery. Tom was just so horrified by all of this that he did a volte-face and now wrote our letter of apology to the Grenadian people, because he's a general practitioner, and he said, this letter is just all full of kind of, language that is activist language that doesn't mean anything. And he wrote a really beautiful, simple letter. And he's now the chair of our trustees. And he was telling this story to the school children in Grenville last week, and he began to cry. And afterwards, they came up to him and said, "Oh, thank you for being so honest." And he said, "No, why are you thanking me for anything? This is all sort of backwards." So to me, I think that's just an interesting example of an unfiltered and a very honest approach. And now Tom, who's 82, he said this is his life's work. Yeah. And he's been studying up on Caribbean debt, and he's written a position paper for the British government on how it should recategorize the Caribbean. Caribbean's categorized as middle-income countries for the purpose of international financial lending. But really, that's an unfair categorization. So Tom has taken this one on.
I love it. He is an example of someone who's evolved, of course.
But evolved later in life.
Right. And I think part and parcel of our conversation evolved in large part because of the effect of the proximity to the problem and his ability to understand it differently.
Exactly.
And I think one of the learnings that we can have from our conversation is not only about sort of histories of racial injustice, but maybe for any kinds of harms done to individuals, groups of people, is understanding that harm and not sort of a voyeuristic or I don't know, disingenuous way, but really being proximate in ways that help you understand might enable you to take a different position.
Right. I mean, it just shows you that to be older is not to be closed-minded.
Absolutely.
If you're a lifelong learner.
Absolutely. I have 3 questions from our earlier in life lifelong learners, our students at Vassar, and then we'll be done. You down for them?
Absolutely.
Okay. The first one is, how do you think you or your family has profited from this new body of work, the documentary, sort of the press about the work you've done in Grenada? How have you all profited from that?
Is the question financially profited?
I'm not sure. Answer it however comes to you.
Well, I think I would hope that we haven't profited. I certainly know that we haven't financially profited. But I think if we've profited, it's from building relationships in Grenada that for all of us, it's been incredibly meaningful, to meet people and to be welcomed, actually. And that's not to say, of course, when we were invited to Grenada to deliver our family apology, there were definitely people who said, well, what does this change? What does this do for me? Why is this even important? Right. But there were also people who came up to us and who continue to be in touch, who said, one woman said to me, I feel like a burden that I didn't know that I was even carrying has been lifted by your apology. And my now good friend Nicole Phillip, the Grenadian historian, was very excited by that because that was what she felt.
Yeah, she sort of intuited that would be
exactly.
The outcome.
She was pleased because that was what she
was hoping for.
Hoped could be an outcome. So, in the sense, if there's been profit, I think it's in expanding one's horizon, making new friends, and continuing to learn because it's not a journey that's over.
Absolutely. Thank you. The next question you actually sort of answered a little bit before, but the question was, how do your children think about this body of work?
That's a really great question. And I have 3 boys who are 18. One is a freshman in college, 22 graduated from Wesley and the squash one last year, and then one who's 24 graduated 18 months ago. And I think their attitude to it is that they're very supportive, but they didn't want to sign the family letter of apology because, this is 2 years ago now. They were in American universities at a moment where the racial reckoning was still sweeping across campuses, and it's unfortunate, but I don't think that they felt that they wanted to be identified as descendants of enslavers when all of that was going on. And I respect that. Yeah. They said, this is your journey, Mum.
Right. Don't drag us into it.
I mean, thanks very much, but I don't know that I want to be out there saying that at this moment. And 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 they have a right to be who they are and not to be defined by their parents.
And their great uncle, I guess, they might evolve.
Well,
as their
they're
life goes
Americans.
on.
They've grown up here. That it feels very distant to them. But actually, as it's all gone on, they've been very supportive, and I hope that they'll come to Grenada with me, and I hope that they'll become involved in the family charity, because it will need a new generation. Yeah. And I think that they would enjoy meeting all of the, Caribbean contacts that we have. They've met people here, but not right. there. So, but I think it's a great question. And I think, to me, there's a sadness in the, I guess the ideological conformity of student campuses in America, that
they would not feel that they could even
they would feel that they would be condemned just even
for acknowledging a part of their family's history.
Right. And that, to me,
it's diagnostic.
It's very bad.
Yeah.
And that, is partly what swept Donald Trump to power, is a backlash against that kind of intolerance and rigidity. And, if you're not with us, we're going to condemn you and we're going to call you out. And
sort of our cancel culture.
Right. Yeah. And so there's something to be learned from that, I think.
Absolutely. And the last question, I think, is related to much of what we said. But the question is, how has your language around reparations changed as you've been more involved in the work?
I mean, I'm not a believer in language policing. I think you have to speak the language of, and again, this is my training, working for the BBC, where we had a big global English-speaking audience.
Right.
You have to use the language of the lowest common denominator. Your aim is to be understood and to be heard, and not to, again, be using language that is policed. So I don't believe in compelled speech, which I think is another, issue of the left, and particularly of the campus left. But that's my position. Yeah. And in the Caribbean, people talk about slaves and slavery, and also use words that would never be used in America, and which I wouldn't dream of using myself. But just the other day, a woman was describing to me the word that's used in the Caribbean for the sort of area in the plantation where the descendants of slaves lived at abolition and for 100 years after that. And these are words that you couldn't use in America, but are in common use in the Caribbean. And I'm thinking about it all because I want to write. This one woman in particular was such an extraordinary character, and talked about everything that her grandmother went through. And, there's a lot to write about. And what language does one use? I think if you're quoting someone else's experience, then you can use the language that they use. Yeah. But I've worked closely with Professor Vereen Shepherd, who was the director of the Centre for Reparations Research at the University of the West Indies. And Vereen is very explicit about the fact that you should talk about the enslaved and about transatlantic chattel slavery. And so I've been very influenced by Vereen, because she's a formidable Caribbean intellectual that you would not want to mess with.
And you've learned from her.
Many things.
Happy to admit that.
Many things from Vereen. She's just another extraordinary, Caribbean intellectual and a towering force.
Wonderful. Well, Laura, it's been such a privilege to have you here today and just start this conversation. And I'm happy that we've been able to talk about it, and hope that it has sparked some interesting thoughts, ideas, and curiosity of those who listen. So thank you for joining me in the conversation.
Well, Wes, thank you so much for the opportunity and for the great questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. See you soon.